All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning share. To thank our TALMUD Torah sponsors for the month of Cheshvan, those families who dedicated all the shiurim and drashos this month. To thank Steve and Teri Czinn for in loving memory of Steve's father, Bunim Tzvi ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th Yahrzeit. Leah Sol, as zechus refuah sheleimah for her daughter Ilana bas Esther, and for all of those wounded in Eretz Yisroel. Yonason Rachel Wolff for a complete and lasting refuah for Refuel Yitzchak Baruch ben Esther. Jerry and Sora Wolasky, and the zechus refuah sheleimah for Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira, and Azriel and Iris Miller in the zechus of the holy soldiers of the IDF, and the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. And of course, we have chosen to dedicate all of maseches Bava Kamma in memory of Master Sergeant Eliyahu Michael Harush Hy'd. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD Torah, he will have a complete, his neshama will have an aliya, and his family a neshama. And we'll say with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today, Baruch Hashem, an incredible daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Daf Ches. And we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on Zayin Amud Beis. We left off specifically again at the two dots on 7b, 2, 4, 6, 8, 9 lines up from the bottom. So let's say, remember again, we ended off yesterday. We actually kind of found ourselves in the middle of. Thank you. We found ourselves in the middle of two really very interesting topics. So topic number one was a fundamental machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel about how do we assess damages. So, in other words, let's just bring that for just a second. So remember again, if we take a step back, the Torah itself tells us that when you damage, you pay with meitav sadeu or meitav karmo, the best of your field and the best of your vineyard. So we'll say issue number one, just to frame everything for us. So issue number one is that, remember, that's talking about real estate. What about if you pay with other things? So we extrapolate from that. Remember, so in yesterday's Gemara we saw the drush of Yoshiv, and Yoshiv teaches us that the truth is you have the ability to pay with whatever you want. You have the ability to pay not just with real estate, but with movable property as well. So the shaila becomes halacha l'maisa. How do you assess meitav? How do you assess the best? So remember again, this became a machlokes in Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel telling us that we assess according to the nizak, according to the best property of the damaged party, and Rabbi Akiva telling us that halacha l'maisa, you go ahead and assess through the mazik, ultimately damages property. So that machlokes is still kind of hanging out there, which in Eretz Hashem we're going to see the Shulchan Aruch in just a little bit. The other piece that we took from our discussion yesterday is, what about, I understand that when it comes to real property, real estate, that if you pay compensation for damages with real estate, you have to pay from the best. What about movable property? Is there a din essentially of meitav? Is there a din of paying the best with movable property as well? So the Gemara came to a very interesting conclusion, which is that it's only with real estate that there's like this subjective idis, benonis, ziburis idea, different grades. When it comes to movable property, what's interesting, the Gemara seems to indicate everything is called idis, right? Everything is called meitav. Why? Because there's always a market for movable property. And if not here, somewhere else. Real estate, obviously, because it is attached to the ground, right? The only market in which you could market it, so to speak, is the present market. So you're limited, right? Real estate is always represents a limited market. Movable property gives me an unlimited market. So as such, movable property is always going to be considered meitav, always going to be considered the best. So that's what we've accomplished. That's what we accomplished yesterday. We're going to build on that a little bit today. So asks the Gemara, Boy mini Rav Shmuel bar Abba me'akrunya Rabbi Abba. So Rabbi Shmuel bar Abba asks from Rabbi Abba, Kishen Shamin. So when they assess, so now that we've established that if I damage Ruvain, I'm paying with the best of my property. Now again, which best, right? Which best? Is it Nizak's best? That's Rabbi Yishmael. Is it Mazik's best? Rabbi Akiva. But we assess with the best. The Gemara asks, here's my question. B'shalohin shamin or b'shalolamin shamin? So here's the shaila. In general, how do you assess the best? Is the best a relative statement or a subjective statement? What do I mean by that? Is it we look at my portfolio, whoever the my is, right? We look at my portfolio, and again, I look at everything that I have, and best is best of what I have, or is what I have somehow measured up against a more, we'll call it universal standard, societal standard, based on what people consider to be the best. So I'll leave it Rabbi Shmuel Silber. So according to Rabbi Shmuel, it's not a shayla. Why? But now remember again, Rabbi Shmuel himself says that in general, when you pay with meitav is assessed based on the damaged property's portfolio. So that's not a shayla, it's clear. We're looking at the damaged party's portfolio. We look at what the best of the property that he has, and we base payment on that. So kiti ba'ilcha, where does the machlokes come? Where does the question come up? I'll leave it to Rabbi Akiva, so also the shayla is according to Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, right? Rabbi Akiva holds that when we pay damages, we pay based on the mate of the best property of the damager. So my mate of sadeh amrach marla me'ute dinizak. So when the Torah says mate of sadeh, the damager pays with the best of his property. Is that saying the best of his property means the best of the damager's property to exclude the damaged party's portfolio? Ol dilma leme'ute de alma nami. So, or maybe not. Maybe what the Gemara is coming to say is that Allah Chalamayim is also coming to exclude that best doesn't refer to what we'll call like a universal standard, but best mean in accordance with what the damager has. Amar le Rachmana, so the Torah Amar le, so he says Rachmana Amar meitav sadeu va'at Amar b'shal olam hinshamin. So we'll say, so it's pretty obvious. In other words, at the end of the day, according to Rabbi Akiva, if you're holding meitav sadeu, that the damager pays with the best of his property, we'll say, what does best of his property mean? It means his property. In other words, why would you even think to somehow say that we're going to look at some greater universal standard? It's pretty obvious. His property means his property. Say, Zecharya Dov, Ela idis kulam government. So we'll say this is actually a really interesting case. So take a look at Rashi for just a moment. It's the last Rashi on the daf. Elo Ela idis, Rashi says, B'misha hayu alav balchov ksuvas isha unezikin. They both say, now watch this guy, Ruvain. Right? Ruvain at this point has 3 outstanding obligations upon him. Number 1, he owes money. Number 2, he's getting divorced. And number 3, he's injured someone. It's a bad day, right? But Lamaisa, so now he has these 3 outstanding financial obligations against him. They both say, now let's just point out something very interesting over here. Each of these 3 obligations are paid from a different sug, from a different category of property. So just to illustrate this, we're going to see this now for just a second. Nezikin is paid from idis, best property. Ksuva is paid from ziburis, and balchov is paid from beinonis. That's how, again, we're going to spell that all out in here in just a second, but that's how the halacha works. So I'll say, so watch this case. So the Gemara says, "Ein lo ela idis." So what happens? We'll call him Ruvain. So now Ruvain owes money to a creditor. Ruvain owes money to an ex-wife for a ksuva, and Ruvain owes money to Shimon because he damaged him. Okay, now watch this. Ein lo ela idis. Let's say Ruvain only has idis property. That's all he has is idis. So what's the halacha? Kulam government idis. Okay, everybody collects from. In other words, we'll say, remember the whole concept of like, this one collects from here, this one collects from here, this one collects from here, presupposes that what? That you have it. Obviously, again, if you don't have it, and you only have one particular sug of property, so that is going to be from where the creditors collect. So if you only have idis, kulam government idis, beinonis, if all he has is beinonis, kulam government, beinonis, ziburis, kulam govin ziburis. So I will say, so that's the halacha. In other words, if all you have is one bucket of property, so at the end, or one category of property, that's where everybody collects. Now watch this. Hayulo idis ubeinonis viziburis. What happens if he has 3 categories of property? So then again, nezikin beidis, so damages collect from idis, balchov beinonis, creditor collects from beinonis, uksubas isha beziburis, and ksuba collects from ziburis. So we'll say, so again, so fine, that's the straight out halacha. Idis ubeinonis. Now this is interesting. What happens if I only have idis and beinonis? Right? In other words, I just have these 2. I have the 2 extreme categories: best property and inferior property. So what's the halacha? Nezikin beidis. So damages collect from idis because that's where they normally collect from. Balchov uksuvasisha bebeinonis. Sorry, balchov. Did I skip? No. So Idis ubenonis. Sorry. So idis ubenonis. I only have idis and benonis. So I have top shelf property and middle category. So nezikin beidis. So nezikin collects from idis. Balchov ksuvas isha bebenonis. So creditor and ksuva collect from benonis. Now both say. So again, understand what happened over there. So remember, Balchov normally collects from benonis. Ksuva normally collects from ziburis. But in this case, what? You don't have ziburis. So therefore, again, ksuva collects from benonis as well. So we'll say next case, benonis v'ziburis. What happens if Reuven only has benonis and ziburis? So what's halacha? Nezikin u'balchol b'benonis. So damages and balchol will collect from benonis. U'ksuvas isha b'ziburis and ksuva from ziburis. Ksuva from ziburis. We'll say top of chas. Idis v'ziburis. One last case. What happens if halacha l'maisa? Reuven has two categories of property, idis and ziburis. So what's the halacha? Nezikin be'idis, nezikin will get from idis, u'balchov ksuvasisha beziburis, and balchov and ksuvasisha ultimately will get ziburis. Now I will say, now this is interesting. So why is it, so ksuv, remember, so nezikin is always from idis, ksuva is always from ziburis. What's interesting is, what do we do with balchov? Instead of kicking balchov up, we kick balchov down. Now we're going to see the reasons for that. Rashi already here highlights it. Look at the top Rashi on the daf. Idis ziburis nezikin beidis ubalchov ksuaseshu beziburis. Timidaraisa balchov beziburis kidul kamon. V'rabbanon hu detikon leba benonis mishum neilas delis bifnei or lovin. V'hecha deles le benonis les la takanta. So this is actually very interesting. We're going to see that midaraisa. We say just a few lines from now. Midaraisa, a balchov really only collects from ziburis. That's really the halacha. We'll see where that comes from. Chazal stepped in and said, listen, if, both say in general, lending money to another Jew is not a profitable endeavor, right? It's what I'm obligated to do, but it's not profitable. I can't charge interest. Right? So as it is, there's always a concern of, and by the way, add to that, Shemitah cancels the debt. So it's not easy to lend money to another Jew. So therefore Chazal said, if he only gets to collect from Ziburis, it's less of an incentive, but at least if you lock him in at Benonis, so at least he knows that if he has to collect real estate, he can collect from Benonis. At least there's somewhat of a financial perk involved in all of this. So what the Gemara is saying over here, and again we'll get into this later, is that halacha l'maisa that din d'Rabbanan only applies when the debtor has Benonis. But if the debtor doesn't have Benonis, all he has is idis and ziburis, then essentially we go back to the Da'oraisa default, which is that a creditor collects from ziburis. Okay, that's that halacha. Now, why do we bring up all of this? So let's remember again, what's our question? What's our question we're dealing with? We're trying to figure out, Rabbi Akiva, according to you, who says, b'demazik shaiminon, that we evaluate the damages based on the best property of the damager. Is that best property of the damager the individual? Or ultimately, again, or let me say differently, do we categorize his best property relative to his other holdings? Or do we categorize it as best property based on some type of universal standard? That's our shayla. So the Gemara says, Katani miha mitzia. So we'll say the most important case to take out of all of this, vis-a-vis our question, is our middle case. What was our middle case? Beinonis v'ziburis. Remember again where Reuven had Beinonis and ziburis. We'll say, what was the halacha in the case of Beinonis and ziburis? So the Gemara says, Nizikin ubachov bebeinonis. So in that case, again, damages and creditor take from Beinonis. Uksuvas isha beziburis. And ksuva takes from ziburis. Now watch this. V'i amrit b'shalohein shamin. So we'll say, so now if we say that according to Rabbi Akiva, when you say b'demazik shaiminan, that we assess idis based on the holdings of the damager. If that's how we do it, we base on the damager, then I will say, then tas te'aset beinonis shalo ki idis v'yitche b'achov eitzo ziburis. So I will say, if this whole thing, right, if the assessment is subjective, based on the damager, then I will say, if you have a case of where Reuven has Beinonis and Ziburis, so what should we say? If these are his holdings, I will say, then what should you say? The Beinonis really becomes what? Idis, because it's his best property that he has. The Ziburis effectively, well, the Ziburis could either remain Ziburis or become Beinonis, so that doesn't matter as much. What matters for us is, if this is his best, then what the Welt, so to speak, calls Beinonis, for him becomes idis. Now the fact of also that doesn't happen indicates the fact that a guy. So essentially, what the Gemara is saying is like this: if categorizations of idis, beinonis, and ziburis are just totally subjective, then essentially every single person always has what? Always has idis. Right? Because what does idis represent? Idis represents the best of what you have. The best of what you have. So the fact that we don't have a category like that, but that halacha l'maisa, there is this concept of someone just having beinonis and ziburis, would seem to indicate that we're using some type of what we'll call like universal sounds too big, but we'll call societal categorization, and not just simply a subjective personal categorization. To which the Gemara says, no. Hamas, what's the case here? Kigon shahaisalo idis umachra. No, both say, so the case over here is where Ruvain, the guy in question, he had idis. No, he had objective idis, benonis, and ziburis, and what happened? He sold it. So now we'll say that's why he has these other categories, because at one point in time he did possess idis, but now he sold it off. Rashi says over here, machra, la'achar halva. So we'll say, so here's what's happening over here. So Ruvain had idis, benonis, and ziburis. He borrowed money. He's a creditor. He's a debtor, And now what happened? After he went ahead and he borrowed the money, so we'll say, now remember again, now there's a lien against property after the loan was made. So we'll say that's the case. We're talking about a case where he had idis. He sold off the right. Then at the time he had idis, he borrowed money. Because he borrowed money again, there's a lien against his benonis property. He subsequently sold off the idis. But the lien on the Benonis property still remains. Incredible. This seems to be clear. Since there's another case that says as well, Benonis viziburis, if a person has, right, Ruven has Benonis and ziburis, so Nezikin bebenonis, ubal chov ksuvas isha biziburis. Right? Ultimately, again, so what's going to be the halacha? That Benonis and Balchov, Balchov and ksuvas isha from ziburis. The Gemara says, Kashina Adadi, but they contradict each other. To which the Gemara says, Elo lav shmamina, kansha haisalo idis umachra, kansha lo haisalo idis umachra. Ultimately, again, I will say, so you see that there's a distinction. What's the distinction here? The distinction, ultimately, again, is that halacha l'maisa, one is talking about where he had idis at the time that he sold. He had idis and he sold it. And one is talking about a case where he didn't have idis and he sold it. So I will say, so therefore, what the Gemara is making the following distinction, which is quite fascinating. In general, the Gemara is suggesting we do go ahead and use a subjective determination, right? Idis, benonis, and ziburis is a subjective categorization based on a person's personal holdings. So if that's the case, then I will say that halacha l'maisa, how can you ever have a case of where a person just has benonis and ziburis? Doesn't the Benonis automatically become Idis? No. You know when that would happen? That would happen when a person did have Idis, Benonis, and Ziburis, engaged in a transaction, created different liens on different property, subsequently sells off the Idis. See, the Idis is no longer there. The categorizations don't move. Why don't they move? Because they are already encumbered. So again, if they're not encumbered, then Einachinami, everything shifts. If they are encumbered, then they remain as they are. Incredible. We'll say the other possibilities as well. It could be that both cases are talking about where he didn't have idis. Right? Good. Yeah, we'll say, so again, we're contrasting that last case where it says Benonis viziburis, person just has Benonis and ziburis, nezikin bebenonis, balchov ksuvasisha biziburis. So that contradicted the previous case. Now we're just trying to figure out how do we resolve it. Could be that both cases where you never had idis. Velo kasha, and there's still no contradiction. The second brisa, the shavya benonis shalo ki idis da'alma. We'll say it could be that in case number 2, in second brisa, that maybe my benon or Ruvain's benonis is so good that his benonis is like idis of the general world. V'kan, and I will say ultimately again the first brisa, that ultimately again his benonis was not as valuable ultimately again as the idis of the world. I will say another possibility of resolution. Idi, both cases. Maybe I will say both cases, both prices, are where my benonis, right, Ruvain's benonis, is considered to be, or I should say, meets the standard of universal benonis. V'hacha b'hapligi. I will say, so what's the machlokes? Mar savar b'shalohin shamin, or mar savar b'shalolin shamin. So I say, now we come full circle. maybe I will say the machlokus between the brises is how you evaluate property. Do you create idis, beinonis, ziburis categories based on a subjective metric? In other words, we look at all of Reuven's holdings, and based on Reuven's holdings, right? Let's say Reuven owns 3 fields. We look at the 3 fields. We say, okay, it looks like here's your best field. That's your idis field. Here's your middle grade field. That's your beinonis field. Here's your inferior field. That's called your ziburis field. So do we evaluate this property like that, or no? Do we look at Reuven's holdings and say, let's measure this against some type of societal standard? And based on society, this is going to be this is going to be this is going to be that. Or it could be, what's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is, once we saw, if we're using a personal standard, so Reuven is definitely going to have what? What is he definitely going to have? He'll definitely have all 3. In other words, assuming he has 3 fields, he'll have all 3. And the truth is, maybe not. It could very well be that 2 of the fields are exactly the same. But for our purposes, he'll definitely have what? He'll definitely have idis. That's what we're looking for. He'll definitely have idis because one of them, quote unquote, is the best of what he has. If, however, you're using what we'll call the universal or societal standard, he may not have idis. He may not have idis. And that can be the reconciliation between the brises. Ravina says, no. Both says, because I said before, in reality, they are arguing about ula. Rabbi said, now what did Ula say? Rabbi said, this is incredible. This is a very, very, very important Gemara. The Amr Ula. Devar Torah, Ba'chol Bizbur. Rabbi said, this is what we spoke out on the top line of Chesam Dalet, the top line of this daf, and in the first Rashi. Ula says, Midaraisa, Ba'chol Biziburis. We'll say Midaraisa Balchov only collects from inferior property. Now, where do you get that from? Listen to this. Shenemar, Bachutz Ta'amot, Va'ish Asher Ata No Shebo, Yotzi Elecha Esa Avot Hachutza. Now, I will say, the context over here is something totally different. The context over here is, I lend Reuven money. So the halach is, I want collateral. No problem with that. What does the Torah tell me? The Torah tells you that when you go to get collateral, wait outside. Do not walk into the debtor's home in order to take the collateral. Wait outside. And you go ahead and wait for him to bring you whatever collateral he wants to bring. I will say, this is part of the general motif of tzedakah, which is, it's not just what you give, it's how you give. And I will say, again, maintaining the dignity, I will say it's also very important. One of the things I see, I learn from many of you, every morning is, when the holy Jews come around collecting money, let's say, it's very beautiful to see. I think there's something very special. Like, many people they give with eye contact and the smile, and the good morning. And I get to see my Shmuel Silber sits right in front of me, so I get to see him. He would think he's best friends with every single guy coming around. And I'll say it's so important. It's so important. You could go ahead. People avoid eye contact and they put out they put out the what do they call the blue paper? Scripts, right? Or the dollar. I will say, like keeping their eyes on the sitter. 30 seconds ago, that guy was checking his email in the middle of Shemona Esrei, right? And now suddenly I can't take my eyes out of the sitter. You can take your eyes out of the sitter to make eye contact with another Jew, right? I mean, don't check your email during Shemona Esrei also, right? But the last one say there's such a din in bin adam l'chavera, it's always important. No one chooses that life. No one grows up thinking, I'm going to be the person who's going to go ahead and be away from my family and collecting money, right? No one ever chooses that. Maybe some people default to that as an occupation when they have no other options, but no one, when they're young, dreaming about what they're going to be or what they're going to do, has that in mind. You don't have to make a person feel worse about a difficult financial predicament. So much of giving is not about how much you give, but it's the attitude you take to the person who you are giving to. So the Gemara says here's something amazing. The Gemara says, okay, I lent Reuven money, so now he owes me collateral. He owes it to me. I'm not asking for it because he owes it to me. Okay, I got it, he owes it to you. There's a way to take it. And you're not going to walk into his house and say, like, Ani Agever, like I'm the man, go ahead and give me what I want. Wait outside, and he'll bring you what he feels he can give you as collateral. And I will say, now, why is this important? So the Gemara says, Ma darko shel adam lahotzi lechutz. What would a person normally bring outside? Right? In other words, I will say, so if the Torah is telling me that I am to wait outside and the debtor is to bring me the collateral, what kind of item does a person normally bring outside? Pacho shebekelim. something usually not that valuable. So we'll say, so that's the idea. So Ula says, you see from here, that ultimately, again, now what's the ochap with collateral? What's the ochap with collateral? The ochap with collateral is that halacha l'maisa, in the event that the debtor can't repay, what do I do with collateral? What do I do with it? I could keep it and use it in satisfaction of the debt. So therefore, collateral is considered to be in halacha a particular form of repayment. So Rabbi says, so because of that, what you see from here, Ula says, is that halacha l'maisa, Baal Chov collects with ziburis. Baal Chov ultimately, again, only has an entitlement, a creditor only has an entitlement to inferior grade property. So the Gemara says, Umatam amru Baal Chov bebenonis. So we'll say, so why did Chazal say that a Baal Chov could collect with benonis, middle grade property? To which the Gemara says, Kadei shelo tino delas bifnei lav. And as we saw before, that Allah Chalamais again, if a person knows they can only collect from ziburis, maybe they're not going to be as excited to lend. Therefore, again, halacha l'maaseh, Chazal said, collect with benonis. That way, it incentivizes the creditor a little bit more. So the Gemara says, "Mar islay takanta du ula, or mar lesay takanta." So we'll say, so again, as much as Ula puts this forward as halacha l'maaseh, it's quite possible that there's an actual fundamental machlokes as to whether or not this takana, do we accept this takana or not accept this takana. So we'll say, what is interesting to note over here is everyone does agree that mid'araisa, Baal Chov only collects with ziburis. That's what everyone agrees. Ula comes along and says that there's a rabbinic enactment to bump up the creditor to be able to collect from benonis. Apparently there seems to be a machlokes as to whether or not we accept Ula or not. So we'll say, so let's spend a moment over here just on the halacha l'maisa. So we'll say this is a good moment to pause at the two dots. So first of all, remember again, all of this kind of stems from how do we paskin? Do we paskin like Rabbi Akiva or Rabbi Shmuel? When assessing damages, so do we go ahead and assess, so we know that Nezikin is going to pay from Idis. So that we know, going to pay from Idis. So we'll say, what's the shayla? Is it Idis to Nizik or Idis to Mazik? Right? At the end of the day, whose best property? So we'll say, listen to this. Shulchan Aruch, Choshen Mishpat. We're going to actually be learning a lot of Choshen Mishpat together, which is very exciting over the course of Bava Kamma, because we'll say there's a tremendous amount of halacha l'maisa that we're going to extrapolate from here. So listen to this. This is Siman Taf Yotes, so Sif Aleph. Here we go. So there's two important halachas involved in this. Number one, Kishabezin Niskakim Ligbos Lenizak, Minichse Amazik. So we'll say in general, when Beis Din has to collect damages from the damager, right? When Beis Din has to collect from that, then what's the halacha? Govin Mehametaltalin Tchila. So we'll say, this is, remember again, we spoke about this. The first thing we collect from is not real property. The first thing we collect from is metaltalin, right? So Ruvain damages Shimon. So now again they're in Beis Din. Beis Din now, so let's say now Beis Din rules, Ruvain, you owe Shimon $10,000 in damages. Fine. So the first thing we're going to collect from, says the Shulchan Aruch, is metaltalin. That's what we go after first. That will say now halacha l'maisa. Let's say Ruvain doesn't have metaltalin, or shelo hayu lo metaltalin kineged kol hanezek, or let's say again Ruvain doesn't have $10,000 worth of metaltalin. Govin hashar me'akarka ha'ma'ula shebenichse hamazik. Here it is. We pass like Rabbi Akiva, right? So the halacha is then we collect from Idis property, but whose Idis property, or how are you assessing Idis property? B'demazik shaiminan. We look at Ruvain's holdings. We look at Ruvain's real estate holdings. We see what is his best parcel of land, and we collect damages based on that. So again, that's the halacha. So we paskin halacha l'maisa, we collect from Idis to Mazik, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Now the Shulchan Aruch actually adds in over here, he says, V'chozman sheim tzamataltalin, afilu subin, ein niskakin lekarka. Afilu sheyesh lo kesef yachol lefra b'subin, duchomataltalin meitav ninor. But now, there's two halachas. First of all, the Rambam says, real estate is only seized as a last resort. In other words, we will always use metaltalin first, even if it's inferior metaltalin. You know, the paradigmatic example of inferior metaltalin is bran, subin. Even if all Ruvain has is subin, is bran, then that's what we're going to take. That's what we're going to take. Money, interestingly enough, I will say, is considered to be metaltalin also. Money is metaltalin, and therefore, again, it's interesting that Allah Chalamais in satisfaction of the debt, we don't even first go after money. We go after metaltalin. Money is metaltalin also. But if he has metaltalin, that's what we're going to go ahead and satisfy payment. Now watch this. He says, why? Techol metaltalin meitav minhu. So we'll say, it's incredible. All three of the points that we made over the course of today, yesterday, and today so far, we begin to see. Number one, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva, b'demazik shem. Well, actually, number one, first we always go after metaltalin, right? We take real estate last. Number two, when taking real estate, we write the damage has to pay with betav. It is. Right? And ultimately, again, we assess it is b'demazik shaiminon, right? Based on Rabbi Akiva with the damager's property. And then number three, all movable property, all metaltalin, is considered to be metav. That's what we just saw at the end of yesterday's up. All property is considered to be metav. So good. So we'll say, so that's the halacha. Again, there's more in there, but Amir Hashem will come back to that later. But very exciting. No, we'll say, isn't that exciting? So we know. Again, this is like damages 101. Now I begin to see exactly what's happening over here. Collect from metaltalin first. Money is considered to be metaltalin. If there's no metaltalin, collect from real estate. What type of real estate? Idis. Whose idis? B'demazik shaimina and Rabbi Akiva. But don't have to pay meta for everything. Yes, but metaltalin is always considered to be meta, always considered to be idis, as we saw before, because there's always a market for it. Incredible. Torah Banon. What says Gavaita? Torah Banon. Another case. Machar la'acher or machar la'echad or l'shlosh b'nei adam kecha. So we'll say now, watch this. Interesting case over here. The halacha is as follows. The halacha, look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi is almost right across. Nichnasu al kuchos kedin ha'mocher u'mishalakach idis yifra l'nizak v'lokeach beinonis. Yeshan supposed to tell you the case. Ruvain. So let's say Ruvain has the same tzaras you saw before, right? Ruvain has a creditor, right? Ruvain owes money. Ruvain's getting divorced, he owes a ksuva, and Ruvain damaged someone. Okay, now Ruvain takes his real estate, and what does he do? He sells it off. Right? So either machar la'echad or l'shlosha b'nei adam. Either he sold all the property to one person, or he sold 3 parcels to 3 people. So what's talacha? Kula nichnesu tachas habaylim. So we'll say, so now remember again, he's selling the property when? After the property is already encumbered to these 3 respective debts. So now, we'll say, can you sell encumbered property? Can you sell encumbered property? Of course. But just understand, the encumbrance is still there. So in other words, you could sell it. Of course you could sell it. We'll say that's why, again, you do a title search, you see if something's encumbered, you could still buy it, whether or not you'd want to buy it. No, we'll say, it has to be like this. Did people buy encumbered property? Did people buy encumbered property? Yeah. But what are they Pashtus, they bought it at a discount. In other words, that's why you would buy encumbered property because you got it at some type of discount. So the discount made it worth it for you to kind of take the gamble. All right. So what's the halacha? So now obviously Reuben sells off the 3 properties. Either he sells 3 of them to one person or 3 of them to individual buyers. Each of them obviously assume the encumbrance. However, the boss says, interesting. What happens if he doesn't sell the properties at once, but he sells them one after the other? Kulan govin mina acharon. So we'll say, so now remember, this is an interesting halacha over here. In general, let's say, right, Reuven has 3 parcels of land, right? And Reuven has 3 creditors. Technically, each of them have an encumbrance against a different piece. He sells off piece number 1. Now we'll say, now remember what happens then? The encumbrances transfer to the 2 remaining parcels. In other words, in general, both say when you have an encumbrance against land, what encumbrance really means is you have a hold against the debtor's real estate. Lav dafka that you have a hold against a particular parcel of land. So what that means is, if I'm Ruvain, right, and I sell off a piece of land, no problem. In other words, I can sell off a piece of land encumbrance free, as long as what? As long as I still have enough real estate to cover my remaining debts. So therefore, both says it's important. So therefore, if Reuven goes ahead and sells parcel number 1, so parcel number 1 is really sold unencumbered, as long as parcels 2 and 3 still are valuable enough to cover the remaining debts. That's what he's saying over here. So the Gemara says, B'za'achar. If you sold a piece of property one after the other, so kulam govim mina achron. Then ultimately, again, all of them collect from the last buyer. Because remember, again, the last buyer was the one who bought the last unencumbered piece of property, or the last encumbered piece of property, and therefore Allah said they all collect from him. Ein lo, and then also what they do is they work their way up. If there's not enough to collect from buyer number 3, then what? They go up to buyer number 2. Go ein lo govem mishalafonov, ein lo govem mishalifnei panav. So we'll say, so that's the halacha. So again, two basic halachas. Reuven has 3 creditors, 3 pieces of property. He sells off all 3, right? Either to one person or to 3 buyers simultaneously. all of them assume the encumbrance. If he's selling off the properties one by one, then again, halacha l'maisa, essentially the encumbrances end up switching or end up devolving to the property that he still owns. So therefore, again, essentially, it's going to be like I guess, like to use an accounting term, it'll be like like LIFO, but the opposite, like last in, first out. But it's really like the opposite over here. In other words, the last property sold will be the first one that the creditors could go to collect from. If there's not enough, they work their way up like that until they get to the first purchaser. Incredible. So, what's the case of selling all the property to one guy? So, if you were talking about that he sold it mamish at once, so we'll say, so obviously in the case where you're selling it to three people, we'll say, but Pashtus, you can't make three transactions simultaneously, right? Someone has to come first. So we'll say, if you're telling me when you sell it to three, right, now we're selling it to three simultaneously. But Pashtus, there's no simultaneity, right? Which means someone must have come first, and yet what's the halacha? We say again, all three of those buyers assume the respective encumbrances. So we'll say, so it goes without saying that if you're selling all three to one, where there is a simultaneity, that halacha l'maisa, of course, that one enters into all of the encumbrances. To which the Gemara says, al pshita b'zeh achar zeh. Rather, I will say it has to be that even though you're selling it to one person, but what? You're selling each property one after the other. So I'm sorry, So I'll say if that's the case, where even when I'm selling to one person, I'm selling him one parcel, and then the next day another parcel, and the next day another parcel. So why is that different? Why is that case different than selling it to three people? So the Gemara says, I'll tell you why. We'll say here's the difference, because when you sell it to three people, right, each potential purchaser could say, listen, I left you, can say to the creditor who comes to collect the land, I left you land to collect your debt from. Leave me alone. I only purchased one parcel from Ruvain. There were two remaining parcels. Collect your debt from there. So the Gemara says, "Hay nami akol chad v'chad le'molei hinachti l'chamakom legos." I will say, even when Ruvain sells to one purchaser, that one purchaser could also say, "Listen, leave me alone. I left you somewhere to go ahead and collect your money from." To which the Gemara says, so Hakam asking, what's the case here? Kigon shalakach idis ba'achrona. Interesting, I will say. The case over here is where the purchaser bought the idis property last. Idis property last. V'chein amar of sheishes kigon shalakach idis ba'achrona. Where ultimately the purchaser purchased the idis last. So I will say, now what does that mean? Take a look at Rashi. Shalakach idis ba'achrona. Tenecha leila meisavlu ki denaihu v'lo lezlo basar idis. So I will say, this is actually interesting. The case is where the purchaser bought idis last. Now, both say, now technically speaking, if you purchase idis last, that means where could all of the creditors collect from? Where do they all collect from? Idis. In this case, what the Gemara is saying over is something very interesting. I will say, so just imagine the following situation. Reuven has, we're fine. Reuven has three creditors, right? Reuven damaged someone, Reuven owes money, and Reuven's getting divorced. Right, so that means he has three creditors, Idis, Benonis, Ziburis. Okay? Now Reuven sells all three pieces of property to someone, Idis, Benonis, and Ziburis. The case over happens to be he sells it to one person. I would say, but the way the purchaser bought the property was how? He bought it, for example, Ziburis, Benonis, Idis. Now, technically speaking, when everyone comes to collect, where are they collecting from? Right? Remember, the way collections work is you collect from the last unsold field first, which means they're all collecting from Idis. Now, what Reuven could do, because he's the sole purchaser of land, he could say, you know what? No. I'll let you all collect from the technical places that you're entitled to. Right? So in other words, he'll say to the woman, you collect from the wife, you'll collect from Ziburis, Balchov, you'll collect from Benonis, okay, Nezek, you'll collect from Idis. Right? You'll collect from Idis. And he has the ability to do so because he is the purchaser of all three fields. That's what's happening over here. It's in his best interest. He doesn't want everyone collecting from Idis. even though technically speaking, that was the last unsold field. So the Gemara goes back to Ihachi, Leisu kulhu v'ligvu me'idis. So if that's the case, one second, then everyone should collect from idis. Mishum da'abarlahu ish tikaso v'shaklisu kidinaichu shaklisu. So because the purchaser can say to the creditors as follows: if you're quiet, and you collect, as I'm telling you, you could collect, fantastic. V'ilo mahadrina shtar diziburis l'marei v'shaklisu kulam kulchu miziburis. This is great. This is incredible. Now watch this. Just watch how this plays out. It's so exciting. Watch how this plays out. So I will say, by the way, so much better to give daf without recurring hiccups, right? I have to thank my doctor, Dr. Goldberg, who Mamish stepped in and Pashat, what do you do? Yes. I'm on like a whole cocktail of stuff. Right? It's incredible. And feeling very good in general. I would say, so thank you. And for all the home remedies, thank you. I teaspoons of peanut butter on my tongue, under my ear, and my big toe. Thank you. Let's say, suggest something amazing. So watch this. Watch what's happening over here. So remember again, Ruvain owes money to these three respective people, right? So he's got, remember again, an ex-wife, a creditor, and someone who he damaged. Now Reuben is selling off all of his property, right? Idis, Benonis, and Ziburis. He sold it all to one purchaser. Now I will say, so remember again, but now what's happening over here is he sold off Idis last. So remember again, the halacha is when you're buying property, encumbered property, the way it works is the last property bought is the source of collection for everyone. So now watch this. The ex-wife is getting very excited. Why is she getting very excited? Right? Because normally, for a ksuva, what is she entitled to collect from? Ziburis. Right? But now, halach l'maisa, what can she collect from? Idis. Same thing with the Balchov. The Balchov normally could only collect from Benonis. Now he's going to collect from Idis. So we'll say, so now they show up to purchaser. And purchaser says, calm down. I'm paying, right, Isha, I'm paying you from Ziburis. Balchov, I'm paying you from Benonis. But they say, no, the halacha is, we get to collect from the last field sold. C says, if you want to play that game, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to return the Ziburis field to Reuven. And if I return the Ziburis field to Reuven, then guess what? All of you only collect from Ziburis. Because that's the way it works. Now, for the Isha, it doesn't make a difference because she's getting Ziburis regardless. But for the Balchov and the Nezikin, it makes a tremendous difference. So Reuven is interesting. So Reuven has the ability to say, either you accept collection as I want to give it to you, which is according to normal categories, right? Or I return the Ziburis field, and all of you are relegated to Ziburis position collectors. Incredible. So fascinating. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Benezikin nami nemahachi. If that's the case, I will say again, he could do that by Nezikin as well. To which the Gemara says, Eliyahu Michael Biyasmins. Interesting, I will say. Rather, we're talking about over here where the case of the borrower, the case of the lova, the borrower died and he left behind Yisomim. Delav b'nei pira'oninu. Because I will say, remember again, Yisomim in general are not obligated to pay back the debts of their father. Vishibuda delay ale. And ultimately, again, so the Gemara says, Vishibuda delay ale didei ramya. So I'll say, so ultimately, again, it's interesting. In this case, the Yisomim are not obligated ultimately to satisfy the debt of the father, and therefore the debt in its entirety really passes down to anyone who purchased property from the father before his passing. Therefore, again, they have the inability to say this. Taima my amrabanan ein nifra min nechasim mishubadim b'makom sheyesh b'nei chorin mishum takanta didi. Now we'll say, rather, what could happen over here? What the purchaser could say is like this. Then in general, the halacha is, we'll say, and this is important halacha, you can't collect from encumbered property in a place where there is unencumbered property. Right? We'll say that's the halacha. So ultimately, the purchaser could say, why did Chazal make that takana? That takana is to protect me, the purchaser. Right? Because again, I will say, to protect me, the purchaser. Ana, b'ha takanta lo nechale. So the purchaser could say, I don't need a takana. In other words, we'll say, so the takana essentially says, you can't collect from unencumbered, from sold property when there's unencumbered property, right? You can't do that. So that protects the purchaser. And therefore, in that case, what that says is, all of the creditors, when they show up, they could only collect from the last property purchased. Now, the purchaser could say, thank you, Chazal, for that takana, for protecting me. I don't want the takana. I don't want takana. Instead, I want to pay back these people in accordance with their actual halachic categorical designations. I want to pay back the Isha from Ziburis, I want to pay back the Balko from Benonis, and I want to pay back the Nezikin from Idis, right? This is the last field anyway. So what's saying you could do that. Why? The Gemara says, Kidrava, the Amarava, HaOmer EFshi betakanas chacham kigonzu, Shomelo. Rabbi said you could do that. If Chazal made a takana that benefits you, and you choose to pass on the takana, ultimately you have the ability to do so. This is very important. Now Gemara says kigonzu, like this case. What's kigonzu? So Gemara says my kigonzu kidrafuna dam ravuna yicholi isha shetomer lebayla eni nizonas ve'eni osa. So we'll say, for example, Chazal instituted that halacha l'maisa, a woman gets mizonos, right? And in kind of like not as a quid pro quo, but reflecting the fact that she gets support. What does she have to do? She gives her ma'asedem, her earnings, to her husband. So she could say thank you, but no thank you. I choose to keep, thank you for making the takana, but I choose to keep my earnings. I choose to keep my earnings and not to be supported by my husband. So she could do that. So therefore, I will say, same idea over here. So purchaser, in other words, in general, we have purchaser protection. Purchaser protection says, if there is unencumbered property, you can't collect from sold property. That same thing says that when a person buys multiple properties from the same person, anyone who's collecting can only collect from the last property purchased. So in this case, purchaser says, well, last property purchase was Idis. He says, thank you, Chazal, for looking out for me. No, thank you. I don't want everyone purchasing from. I don't want everyone collecting from the last property purchase, because the last property purchase was what? Was Idis, and I don't want everyone purchasing from Idis. Instead, I'm happy to honor the claims, honor the debts, but I want to give it out according to the halachic categories. He could do so. Incredible. So pshita, machalokeach benonis viziburis. So we'll say, now watch this. This is now another case, we'll say. So again, we'll say, ultimately, again, this is where you have a guy, right? So remember, Ruvain was the one with all the outstanding debts. Ruvain sells his property to a buyer, and I will say, buyer number one now sells it to buyer number two. So pshita, machar lokeach benonis viziburis. The sheer idis lefanam. So we'll say, so now buyer number one sells to buyer number two. So it's pashit that ultimately, again, if buyer number one sold benonis and ziburis and held back idis for himself, so leisu kula v'ligu me'edus. So now remember again, when buyer number one sells to buyer number two, so when everybody comes to collect, ultimately they're coming to buyer number one, right? There's an order. The same way, first you go to collect from debtor himself, and then only if he doesn't have any unsold properties, you go to purchaser. So too, again, you go to purchaser number one before purchaser number two. So if purchaser number one has any property still that he bought from Ruvain, whatever it is, even if it's Idis, that's where everyone's going to collect from. So the Gemara says, Daha achronahi, o benonis viziburis, less nugabe, because all he has is Idis. This is no more benonis viziburis. So the Gemara says, Dematzi lemeimar lahu, me benonis viziburis, skip. So Vishir Idis Lefanav, Leisu Kulu V'Ligbu Me'idus. Everybody could come and collect from Idis, a purchaser number one. Daha Achronehi, Ubenonis Viziburis Lasnu Gabe. And ultimately, purchaser number one no longer has any Benonis and Ziburis. The Matzi Lemeimar, he could say to them, Gavu mi Benonis Viziburis, Delonecha Lebetakanta Dirabanon. Now, purchaser number one could still choose to go ahead and say, I'll pay you guys, but I'm going to pay you for my own Benonis and Ziburis, and I appreciate the fact that there's a takana that's protecting me, but I don't want the protection. I don't want the protection because the protection will result in me having to pay from Idis, and I don't want to pay from Idis. Aval, Machar Idis is sheer Benonis Ziburis, but if halacha l'maisa again, purchaser number one sold off Idis and he left for himself Benonis and Ziburis, so what's the halacha? Mai, Sabra Bai Lememar, Asu Kulu Gavame Idis. Everyone gets to collect from Idis. Sounds like from purchaser number two. Right? What did purchaser number one sell to purchaser number two? Kol zechus shetav yado. Mostly again, when you sell property, you don't only sell property, but you sell any affiliated right with that property as well. And if the creditors were to come to purchaser number one, matzi agbile mebenos ziburis. They could collect from Benonis and Ziburis. Va'afapi techizavni Benonis v'Ziburis akati idis b'nei chorin havi. And even though he sold off the Benonis and Ziburis, there is still unencumbered Benonis. Ve'ein nifra min nechasim mishubadim calls mandika nechasim meichorin. So I was saying halacha l'maisa. The general klal is wherever there is unencumbered property, you can't collect from encumbered property. And we'll say that would apply in a case of even where purchaser number one sold off property to number two. So even though again encumbrances are transferable, but if purchaser number one still has property, that's going to be the address before anyone goes to purchaser number two. To which the Gemara says, Matzi Amrle lo nechale b'hai takanta. Ultimately, the Gemara says, so once again, he could say, thank you for the takana that protects me, but at the end of the day, I don't need that protection. Lokeach sheni nami matzi amrle gabi. So the second purchaser could also say matzi amrle gabi benonis v'ziguris. Collection benonis and ziguris. Techizabin lokeach sheni, because ultimately again, when the second purchaser purchased the property, adaita de kol zechusa de haveli l'rishon pegava zabin. I will say when you purchase something, this is very important. When you purchase something, you are not only purchasing property, but you are purchasing any associated rights or obligations with that property. Therefore, halacha l'maisa, purchaser number two essentially goes ahead and assumes all the responsibilities of purchaser number one. So we'll have to stop over here for today. I apologize that we did that last piece a little bit quickly, but I will say what we begin to see is something very interesting. That halacha l'maisa, first of all, the same categorical designations as a primary debtor has are transferred over in any property sales. That's what we begin to see. Not only that, but even if purchaser goes ahead and subsequently purchases or sells, those same encumbrances keep transferring and transferring and transferring. That's number one. Number two, whenever there is unencumbered property or unsold property, that becomes the source of repayment, even if categorically it's an inferior source of land. And number three, when Chazal make a takana for your benefit, if you choose to pass on that takana, you have the right to do so. We'll say, shkoyach. All right, Hebron Zoom, good Shabbos, everyone. Good Shabbos, good Shabbos. Shabbos, good to see you. How are you?
I didn't hear a single hiccup.
Baruch Hashem.
So the basketball.